There are a couple stories I hear over and over again from people who are looking to launch no-code apps. Story number one is the person has a job or a career that they've probably been successful in, but they feel like there is a cap on what they can do. There's a cap to their freedom, their flexibility, to their options, and probably to their income streams. And ultimately, they want to build something of their own that they can control and that can give them the lifestyle they're after. Story number two is the person has a business of their own, probably a service-based business, something that might revolve around hourly work, and they're currently running in inefficient ways. And they also feel a cap on their time, a cap on their revenue, and a cap on their own flexibility. And what they're after is an app that can help them run more efficiently, grow their revenue, and again, achieve that freedom and the flexibility that they really want to have. So those are the two stories I most commonly hear from people who are wanting to launch no-code apps. You might have a similar story. And if that's you, then today's video is going to be for you, because we're going to talk about how to make the transition from your current situation to actually being able to have that app that either is your business or that helps run your business more efficiently. Now, stick around until the end, because we're going to talk about how to start this transition, but also how to continue the transition. So from when you are just at your idea stage with your app, you don't even have a product yet, to when you do have a product and you do have users. That whole transition and that whole cycle is really important to understand. So stick around for that. First, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their own businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. All right, so first things first, why is this transition hard? Because it is. That's the reality. If you are going from that current career or job you have, or your current business structure or model, and you're wanting to achieve all of that control and that flexibility, right? The transition from getting to one point to the other is difficult because it involves a lot of different steps. You have to, number one, validate your app idea. You have to build out the first version of your product itself. You have to validate the product, and you have to then roll it out from there. But while you're doing those things, you have to do the most challenging part, which is finding the time. If you are trying to transition from one point to another, at a certain point, you can make the switch to where you are completely removed from the previous situation and you're completely involved in the new situation. But finding that switch point, it doesn't happen right away. And you're going to have to overload yourself a little bit on the way there, sometimes a lot. And I don't say that to discourage you, but I do want to be realistic about what's involved so that you can anticipate and expect it. Now, we ourselves as business owners have made this transition as well. We went from having one particular type of business model, and we completely switched to a completely different business model. And we had to make this transition where we didn't have a lot of time because we still needed to fulfill responsibilities for the old model while we were making the switch, but we had to make the switch at some point. And so we had to go through a period of kind of overloading ourselves so that we could build up the other side, right? Which in your case is going to be the app that you're looking to build, right? So we had to kind of overload into there. And then we had to find the point where we cut ties and we said, okay, we're completely eliminating this one side and we're completely moving into this other side. And that can kind of feel like stepping off of a cliff or taking a big leap of faith in some ways. And so all of this is coming from personal experience and from having seen other people do it as well and learning about what their personal experiences are like from their perspective. Okay, so there are 3 stages that I want to break down in this transition. Stage number 1 is when you're in your idea stage. This is the very, very beginning of what will become your app, what will become your new business or new business model. And when you're in this stage, I've seen people who just never get out of it because even the idea of moving forward and taking on this type of transition is just too overwhelming. There's just too many decisions to make, too much involved, and so they never move forward at all. I don't want it to be that way for you. I want it to be the complete opposite. The planning stage should look at just a few things. One, obviously coming up with your app idea to start with, which if you're watching this video, you probably already have your app idea. So the second thing is validating that app idea. Now, remember that you're using no-code tools. So you're not validating an app idea that you need to then go and invest $200,000 in order to outsource the development of it. That's not the case. So remember, you're validating a no-code app idea, which means you can make a much smaller investment, both time, money, energy, all of that. Okay, so validate the app idea. And the third thing I want you to do is set a time frame. This is really important. If you don't set a time frame for yourself, then when you're making this transition, the actual transition will not happen. I promise that's just the way it goes, because the biggest challenge here is time. You're never going to have enough time. That's just the reality. You're busy. Everybody's busy, right? So unless you put a deadline or a time frame on this transition, it's just not going to happen. That's what we learned personally. We literally had to set a date and say, we are not allowed to continue doing what we're doing after this date. And we had to stick to it. And that was the only way to truly make the transition. So if you start out the transition with a time frame in mind, it's going to make it a lot easier for you. Now, that time frame might look different for you than it does for someone else, and different than it did for us. It really depends on your situation, but I would look at the time frame in a few different ways. One, the time frame of when you are coming up with your idea, thinking through it, validating it, and then deciding to actually build it. That should happen fast. That should not take months and months of time, because you are coming up with an app idea that solves a problem that you yourself should have experience with. It shouldn't take you too long to validate the idea enough to be able to commit to building out the first version of the product. So that first step should happen very quickly. Now, the second step of building out that first version of the product, I would put a time frame of a few months on that. That's what I would suggest. That's what's realistic. That's what you can do. Of course, there are other factors that come into that. You have to make sure you're building the right scope and that you are using the right development strategy, learning the tools correctly so that you can make everything happen within those few months. But that's what I would suggest aiming for. Okay, so that's the first phase, is when you're planning and you're validating and you are moving in to your actual development. And that leads us into the second phase of the transition. The second phase can get a little bit dicey. And again, my goal here is to be realistic with you so you can set your own expectations and actually achieve what you're after. And so this is just real talk here, but this next phase can be tough and not everyone will get through it. The reality is, if you don't commit and execute during this next phase of the transition, you're just going to get lost in it. Okay, so what you have to do is figure out 2 things. So in this phase, you're building out the core of your product and doing your initial launch. Okay, so we're looking at the actual product now, not the initial planning, but the product, and bringing your first users on board. Now, when you get started, you're likely going to be acting as a solo founder, or maybe a small team. And because of that, you are going to have a lot of hats to wear as you go through this phase. You're going to be developer, you're going to be admin, you're going to be marketing, you're going to be sales, you're going to be product testing before you bring your users on board, right? You're going to be wearing all of those hats, all right? And so this is where time becomes a very, very precious thing. With that being the case, I want you to plan on two things. One, what are you willing to commit in order to build and launch your product and bring your first users on board? Are you willing to commit to spending an hour, 2 hours per day in your app and with your user outreach, with your marketing? Are you willing to invest some money in order to get help moving through the process? What are you going to commit to do in order to get your app built as a non-technical entrepreneur? The second thing, and honestly, this is even more important, what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to give up? Because I promise you, there is not magically going to be time in the day for you to just build and launch your app and potentially your entire business outside of everything you're already doing. And so you have to decide what you're willing to give up in order to move through this part of the transition. You are going to have to make sacrifices if you want to build a new business. That's just the way it goes. So what you're willing to give up depends on you and your situation. For us personally, when we were making a transition years ago, we gave up our evenings and our weekends in order to get head down and to make things happen. All right. There wasn't time during the day because we still had our previous commitments, likely as will you. And so that meant during the regular working hours, nothing was going to happen to push us towards that transition. And so if we wanted it to happen, then we had to look outside of those working hours. And that's what we did. Okay, now that meant things like, not watching TV at night, not hitting the snooze button in the morning, not going out and doing regular weekend things, right? Like it just takes making changes. Now, remember, that's not going to be forever. That's not your situation forever. It's your situation during this initial transition phase where you're trying to get enough interest in your app, or if it's for your own business where you're trying to integrate it into your systems and you're trying to get an initial revenue that is going to signal to you that the rest of the transition can happen. Okay, so you have to figure out what are you going to commit in the first place, but even more importantly, what are you willing to give up during that transition period, just so that you can hit the point where you say, okay, the rest of the transition, it's worth it to move forward. I've built up this interest or this revenue or the streamlined processes in my business, and I'm going to continue forward. Now, once you get past the first and the second phase of this transition, that's where things start to get more tactical and where you can actually start honestly doing a little bit of math to help you finish the transition. So at this point, you have done the planning, you've done the validation for your app idea, you've moved forward into the development, and you have built the product, you've brought initial users on board, and you have gotten to the point where you're starting to charge your initial users. So you should have a certain baseline revenue that you've built up. This is the point where you can start looking at numbers. So in order to make the transition and to fully remove yourself from your past situation, whatever it may be, and to fully immerse yourself in the new situation, it has to financially make sense. You have to actually be able to do that, obviously. And so this is where you can start to look at numbers. So I don't necessarily want you to look at how much you want your app or your business to make. I want you to look at how much you personally need in order to say, okay, I no longer need to put any focus into the previous situation, and I'm going to put everything into the new situation. How much money do you need? So for this, I would look at your baseline expenses. You want to be able to build up enough revenue to either cover your baseline expenses and then you can transition out because now you are covered. Or if you start to build up your revenue and it's not covering baseline expenses quite yet, but you're projected to get there within a certain amount of time, and those projections are accurate, obviously, or as accurate as they can be, and you feel comfortable transitioning out of your previous situation, then you can move forward. So here's what I would do. I would go through that planning stage or phase, go through that development stage, and then get the product validation that you need, get your first paying users, and then start to look at the numbers and say, okay, these are my baseline expenses, and this is where the app is at right now. What can I do to get the app from here to baseline expenses? And those things should be your primary focus. Those things are priorities until you can get to those baseline expenses. Once you get to your baseline expenses, if you can, obviously this depends on your own situation, then you can flip that switch and you can complete the transition and continue building up on the other side. So building up your revenue with your app, streamlining your current business even more, whatever that may be. But that's kind of the way you have to do it. And so you have to go through that initial planning phase. You have to go through your initial development phase, which is when time starts to become really precious and it starts to go away, right? You have to figure out what you are committed to doing to make this transition and what you are willing to sacrifice to make the transition. Then you need to get to a point where you hit a milestone of covering your baseline expenses. So as soon as you start making a revenue with your app, you need to have those baseline expenses figured out, because from revenue to baseline expenses, everything that will get you there, everything that will help you make that little segment of the transition are priorities. Okay. And from that point on, once you cover baseline expenses, then it's up to you. Do you want to completely turn off your leave your job, whatever it may be? Do you want to complete that transition at that point? Or for personal reasons, your own situation, do you need to hold on to it for a little bit longer? The one thing I want to add to that is it can be next to impossible to completely turn off the situation you're trying to transition out of, because that's the thing that's giving you support financially right now. And as regular human beings, it can be really hard to say, no, I'm going to choose not to continue with that, even though it's financially supporting me. I want you to keep in mind that if you eliminate everything else that you are focusing on, I want you to ask yourself, how much time and energy is that going to free up to help you finish the transition with your app more smoothly and more quickly? That was honestly something that held us back during our transition for a long time, because it's hard to completely flip the switch and turn off the thing that has been providing financial stability, building or generating a revenue for so long, when you haven't matched that with the thing that you're transitioning into. But if you have your expenses covered and you have validation or confidence that you can continue growing your app or your new business model, if you have that confidence and validation and you give yourself a deadline to say, okay, I'm going to remove focus from all of these other areas and see what I can grow and create if I funnel that into the thing that I want to transition into, you'll surprise yourself. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is at every single point along the way, you're going to have concerns. You're going to feel hesitant about taking the next step because you are walking away from the thing that has been stable for you, and you're moving into something that is ideally a lot better, but it's not certain yet. And so along the way, every single time you have one of those doubts or uncertainties, I want you to use a decision-making process that has helped me tremendously. I didn't come up with this, but it has helped me all the same. For every situation, ask yourself, what's the best that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? And can I live with the worst? Okay, ask those questions, because more often than not, you're going to be going off of gut feeling and emotions, because there's a lot of emotion that is going to be tied to this process. But if you can think rationally through each of these decisions and really answer those questions, what's the best? What's the worst? Can I live with the worst? It's going to make those decisions and those risks feel a lot less intimidating, because you're going to be having these little real talk moments with yourself that can keep you moving forward. And that's helped me and other entrepreneurs tremendously. And so I suggest you use it as well. All right, if you're making this transition, or if you're moving into this transition, know that you're not alone. We've been there. Other people have been there. Many entrepreneurs are doing the exact same thing right now. You can make the transition, no matter how intimidating or unrealistic it might feel at this point. You can do it. Yes, it's going to take work. Yes, it's going to take some risks and some leaps of faith, and probably a lot of real talk with yourself along the way, but you can certainly do it. Now, if you are moving into that first phase where you're going through the planning of your app idea, we have a free workshop over at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop that can help you get started correctly. You can start coming up with the correct scope for your app so that you can keep that timeline and that time frame as small as possible, so you can speed up your transition. It's going to guide you through things you need to know about no-code tools, talk about what you can do with no-code tools, and really just kickstart this transition for you altogether. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop for that. I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.